So it's part of a project supported by the Hewlett Foundation on tax policy in Kenya. And at the time of formulating it, we realized that the design was informed by the fact that from the evidence we found, we saw that there was a lacking, either deliberate or not by design, I would say, but citizen voices were missing from debates on tax policy, and meaningful debate that is. So we had quite a bit on engagement in part of the budget process, but then when it comes to tax policy, either for what we diagnosed as lack of substantive information or the ability to even grasp the concepts around tax policy. We had mostly citizens' voices missing from the tax policy debates. And of course, that translates to something. When you have limited contribution, then the policy that emerges is, of course, missing in terms of inclusion. It does not necessarily respond to the actual needs of various interest groups. Particularly, we looked at special interest groups, and so we saw that there's limited effectiveness of the policy engagement on tax policy by the public, and particularly by special interest groups, resulting in non-inclusive policies. The other reason, or what we thought, of course, we attributed this to was the nature of the tax code. So we have a number of legislation that comprise Kenya's tax code, and we thought that the complexity, the unpredictability, the fact that we have changes every year, and before what you knew last year is applicable as a tax regulation is most likely to change every subsequent year. That lack of predictability and incoherence, together with the lack of response to the needs of special interest groups, we diagnosed as being serious concerns in Kenya's tax code. And we wanted to see how can we design a project where we bring more groups that actually contribute to the discussion, hopefully understand the nature of Kenya's tax system, and thereby make recommendations that can be useful. To make any degree of success, you have to start from somewhere. And so that's why we started from basically just doing this political economy analysis, because it will provide us with some level of knowledge generation that we share with various interest groups, including yourselves. And it's just a starting point. We all know that we had people participate in discussions on the finance bill, for instance, last year, to limited degrees of success in terms of the recommendations that we were making. But we feel that eventually, if we build the public support for calls for reforms and with adequate information, then we might be able to make some change. So the last thing, again, which I've already alluded to, is that this pointed us to a need for public education to support citizen groups, and to build the capacity for acquisition and use of evidence in engagement with policymakers to improve the formulation, review, and reform of Kenya's tax code. So that's that in terms of the background. Then going into now the introduction of where of this study, where we started, which again, of course, I have partly mentioned. It was based on that first realization that Kenya's tax code is not just it's complex. It's not just a set of rules. It's also a reflection of our country's political and economic landscape. The way our tax system is currently is influenced by various factors, not only political and economic ones, but also some historical factors around it. Given that, we thought that the PEA as a tool would help us sort of break down some of that complexity. As I've already mentioned, that we have a number of regulations and provisions that make it challenging for both taxpayers, together with the tax administrator, that's the KRA, to be able to navigate and implement. And so we recognized from our analysis that this complexity is attributable to the socioeconomic, political, and historical factors. The other thing that we realized is that the call for more taxes in Kenya has always been anchored on, we wanted to demystify, because we hear all the time that the call for more taxes is anchored on the need for more development. So we wanted to check, is this the only reason? Of course not, or are there other incentives? Are there other drivers drivers. What are the underlying unspoken drivers that drive the nature of our tax policy or that drive or inform tax policy formulation? So any PEA, for those of you who've engaged with PEAs in the past, looks at incentives, basically what drives the different actors to make the decisions that they do, and in our case, in terms of tax policy. So the actors here, the political actors, we have various political actors, economic actors, some of them including policymakers, we have different institutions, and some of the incentives, for instance, and Leo will tell us more in detail, could be electoral considerations, various vested interests. Sometimes, as we can see them with the current ruling party, it's driven by certain economic ideologies. So we wanted the PEA to tell us broadly what the incentives are for making the decisions that we see. Then any PEA looks also at institutional factors. So basically looking at the formal and informal institutions that have a role in terms of shaping the tax policy. And then, so we looked at all this, the interaction of these institutional actors, as well as the incentives and various drivers. Also remember that according to Kenya's constitution, the authority to set taxes is vested primarily in Parliament. And that's for the national level and also for county level. So revenue generation, that authority, the demarcation is stated in the Constitution, and Article 210 particularly vests the authority to set taxes on Parliament, which obviously underscores the importance of consideration by Parliament, having a holistic approach that considers the various factors that I talked about. Inclusion, the tax policy and the tax code should be reflective of the national interest, if I would say that. So understanding what we'll be trying to show you, or what Leo will be trying to show you, is that understanding the political economy of taxation in Kenya is basically essential to help us comprehend the dynamics behind the tax policies and the implications, to give us some sort of rationale when we make proposals in the past, the future, to know who to approach when we are making the substantive recommendations, who has what powers and what interests, and then help us design what approaches, or see if at all we can be successful in designing certain approaches that would be successful in achieving the recommendations we seek. So that's a brief background and introduction. I will now invite Leo.
So thank you, Jackie, and for the elaborate giving that introduction. So before we start to discuss the political economy analysis of taxation, we need to understand what constitutes the tax code. And the tax code, mainly, we had a small rubric to determine which kind of what constitutes the tax code. And the main one is the legislation, the national law, the supreme law, which is the Constitution of Kenya 2010. The chapter 12 of the Constitution defines what can be collected at the national level and at the county level. It also defines some of those principles of taxation that should be adhered to, and generally the role of taxes in public finance. Additionally, it also gives powers to national government and the county governments to charge for certain services only with the approval of through the approval of legislation. The other main legislations are some of those: the income tax, the value add, the excise, the custom duties, and this is not the entire list, because some legislations carry taxation powers. Some of them could be miscellaneous legislations, which is mostly an omnibus legislation providing grounds for government to tax. And then the other part is the application of the tax code. There are legislations that allow for the application of the tax code. Top three include the Tax Procedures Act, the Kenya Revenue Authority Act, Public Finance, and then the others include subsidiary legislation. These are legislations drafted to operationalize the main law, and also legislations governing the application of the tax code. Largely, we've mentioned the CS National Treasury, but other ministers have been allowed to draft legislation, subsidiary legislation that have taxation power. Some of them include the Minister for Health, the Minister for Labor, for various purposes. Then, after explaining the tax code, we now provide a policy context. The policy context here is to show what the government is collecting at present. And here, we mean the national government. So if you look at the tax act, it gives you a perspective of how the taxation regime looks like. So if you look at it, almost half of all taxes are direct taxes. So the income tax forms a bigger part of Kenya's taxation regime. Secondly, and you'd see the reason why, the political economy reason why that is the case, because largely it's easier for government for the tax administrator, the Kenya Revenue Authority, to collect that kind of tax, and then the rest now come in other indirect taxes, which include value add, excise, and also import duty, among other smaller taxes. So you'll see that outside excise, value add, those are the major forms of indirect taxes. So we'll keep this in mind, because we'll use most of our political economy explanations to give the reason why we see our taxation system being the way it is. So some of the questions that we asked in the study is: what is the nature of the political economy system? What are the structural and institutional factors? The PEA language here is to say, what are some of those factors that emanate from legislation, and what are some of those factors that are institutional, and some of them being historical, that you see in the way a taxation system is. And then, to what extent does the evidence guide Kenya's tax code, formulation of Kenya's tax code, and what are some of those specific incentives towards the optimal tax rate, and then the asymmetries of information in access and influence of this process. So what other players outside constitution, the main actors in the constitution, trying to do to influence that process, and then the formal and informal processes that shape the direction of policy change towards the optimal taxation. So some in the on the onset, some of the factors that we could see is that Kenya's taxation system is not buoyant. And buoyancy, explaining in literal terms, is that proportional change in economic growth is not equivalent to the change in taxation. A 1% change in economic growth does not yield the same in government revenue, and it's due to various factors. Some of those factors include tax elasticity. Some of them include tax rates being outside the Laffer curve, that at some level, those tax rates might not be yielding the same, might be yielding counterintuitive results. They are not generating revenue, but also they are causing unintended consequences in the market, because consumers are substituting one thing for the other, and they're also reducing consumer welfare. Secondly, existence of the add to tax sectors. Just to re-explain, the construct of sector is, see, Kenya's economy is largely informal, but that is not the problem. The big problem is the main tax that government relies on, which is the direct tax that is expected to contribute almost 47% of all taxes in 2023-24, constitutes company income tax, and also the PAYE, the personal income tax. Out of that, a smaller share of the population only works in the formal sector, and then also, additionally, very few farms. So, for example, some of the major farms that contribute to company income taxes that we see are close to 300, and a myriad of other medium and small enterprise farms. But you'd expect that it's a smaller segment of the population and smaller segment of the market that contributes largely to all forms of taxes that we see. Then, additionally, increase in tax rates can no longer does not yield additional government revenue, and then the overall view is that tax code is misaligned with country's economic structure, that those tax rates are moving at a faster rate. And the biggest example to show this is the excise tax on beer and cigarettes. Largely, you would expect that in the Kenyan market, for example, the alcohol sector as a is a dual market, and in the dual market it means that it's both formal and informal alcohol. So any effort through tax rates to squeeze consumption in the formal sector yields actually forces consumers to substitute with informal sector alcohol, which again expands that externality that we are seeing now. Some people passed away in Kirinyaga. That substitution effect is something that comes directly from taxation. So before we start speaking about Kenya's taxation system, where it is and where it should be, we first need to uh, explain a few things about what should be the optimal taxation rate. And the optimal taxation rate is as a result of academic work of two major economists, Peter Diamond and James Marlis, and another economist called Gregory Mankiw. And they define what in technical, both in practical, using practical examples and also theorizing the same, that what should be optimal taxation. And that is optimal taxation is to maximize social welfare while minimizing economic distortion. Taxation in itself, a distortion, creates a distortionary effect because it actually reduces both consumer welfare, consumer surplus, and also the producer surplus, and creating that deadweight loss. That deadweight loss is economic value that is lost completely and and could not be recovered. So these economists provided a basis, and in essence, what optimal taxation it should be is taxes which are low and moderate over the long run, which means that you are creating the minimum distortion effect, that minimum distortionary effect, without without actually harming economic growth and harming that social welfare. So there are some of those. I know you must avoid efficiency, minimize disturbance to economic decision making, and reduce inefficiencies. Uh, Human beings are rational, and rational in economics is to say you find the best, you determine your own welfare, the best welfare. So anytime a tax comes forward, uh, people find ways on how to adapt to it, and they either substitute, they either stop consuming, and that there is also the question of equity, and Jackie has explained that we are very keen with equity as part of this project. The tax code should also be simple, and here it's administrative and compliance questions, uh, transparency, that some of those should have clear understanding of regulations and how taxes are computed. So if you do self-assessment, it should always arrive at to and confidence in a level of almost 99%. Additionally, uh, questions of administrative efficiency, neutrality should not favor one economic activity or decision, uh, uh, unless now, save for those taxing negative externalities, taxes on pollution, taxes on alcohol, taxes on cigarettes, and the rest. But here, all taxes should be non-neutral, should not favor one economic activity over the other. And then flexibility. So this is our own principles that we've iterated on the basis of that literature from Diamond and James, and also Gregory Mankiw, when they defined what should be optimal taxation. Now, just to go directly into the taxation system. So what are some of those political economy factors of Kenya's taxation system? And we identify on the basis of on our own weighting, of what are some of the greatest issues. One of them is now the way we are structured. The taxation system is actually executed. The tax code is executed. Remember that the other main legislations uh, constitutes should directly should give directly directions on how tax policy should be done is done setting those rates and also providing time period on when taxes should be collected and the rest. However, those they don't come in form. Each of those bills is not amended directly. They're amended through the finance bill, and the finance bill is a problem largely because one, it has two elements. One is that it's omnibus. Omnibus is to say uh, you are amending so many laws at the same time, and and the same time, and the omnibus bills have potential to limit debate and scrutiny because of their comprehensive nature. Let me give an example. One of the examples that the IEA participated in, and we really wanted to demonstrate uh, that it's not that should be not a tax is the housing levy. The housing levy in the first version of the finance bill came as a savings mechanism. And then subsequently, in the next versions now through the public consultation, mutated to an housing levy, an housing tax, which is like a tax, and that it again moved to it being an housing tax on persons who have what we'd call a payslip or who are salaried in Kenya, and that became a problem. That so omnibus bills and that the same bill was wanted to is was amending several legislations on related to that housing levy, amending several legislations. Additionally, was part of and the big problem again on the omnibus part is that the same bill was amending other substantive legislations that are not necessarily tax related, but include but some of those legislations were defining functions. The second part of the bill, why the bill is problematic, is that the Public Finance Management Legislation Act of 2012, which is the main legislation determining the nitty-gritties of public finance in Kenya, actually makes it mandatory for the finance bill to be considered in every part of every year. And you remember, optimal taxation is predictability of the tax code. Number two, optimal taxation is that that those taxes have to be low and moderate in the long run. So, but again, this finance bill is not the finance. This aspect of being of that mandatory consideration does not. It considers that the finance bill should be considered on an annual basis, and mostly what we've seen now, a political economy observation, is that those amendments take place without an analysis showing what previous revisions have achieved and whether now using evidence whether those amendments the current revisions should happen. So you'd expect that the National Treasury would only revise the tax code in the medium term, 3 to 5 years, and now using evidence of whether whether the tax was distortionary or evidence why showing that the need for revision, whether you move that rate upwards or downwards, it would yield more revenue. Secondly, and then so we went to the Kenya law and looked at some of these main legislations. You'd see that, for example, a legislation that was introduced in 2015 has been revised, like the Tax Procedures Act, 7 times ever since. The Tax Appeals Tribunal Act revised 7 times again. The income tax has been revised almost from 1974, which is 50 years ago, has been revised 49 times. Customs, so it's annual revision, and that predictability, you'd see why there are complaints with Kenya's taxation system and why it's not buoyant. That is an unintended effect of that. Secondly, the second part of that the unintended consequences of that mechanism of amending taxes through the finance bill, you'd see that the tax code keeps growing. We looked at some of those provisions in the several acts that it keeps expanding. So you'll realize that the customs and excise 985, the income tax 152, the rest. This sampling shows that compared to other destinations that you'd want to say that is is stable macro-wise, but also open for business, uh, are in the ranges of 200, 300, or 500 pages max. But this is closer to 1400 pages, and that's a problem. Again, the second factor that you see is that uh, that explains the political economy of taxation is that the old constitutional PFM norms still exist now pre-2010 constitution dispensation. The new constitution 2010 changed the powers to determine uh, uh, first all forms of fiscal policy, which is uh, uh, direct spending, public debt, taxation, subsidies, and also waivers. All those five forms of fiscal policy are determined by Parliament. They determined changing those powers to Parliament from not having a mixed Westminster model that allows executive would be a member of Parliament, a member of the Minister for National Treasury of Finance, being a member of Parliament to determine that. So it created clear separation of reinforced the doctrine of separation of powers. And then you see that Parliament has been given all powers to determining taxes, what should be formed and contents of budgets, including now taxes. But we see that largely the nuance and now the informal part is that National Treasury determines this, and they determine it in a way that does not allow them to bring forth evidence. Secondly, we see that the Kenya Revenue Authority, as it is, should be a tax administrator, and a tax administrator does not determine policy, but we see a larger part of them determining policy, and we've seen Parliament has donated those powers to determine tax abandonment, to determine inflation adjustment, to determine all those things. And if you look at those things keenly, is that those powers, those powers are powers of the past. Those are only parliamentary powers. And then again, you see the constitution, the reasoning behind those powers being of determining the powers of the past being with parliament and powers of the execution being with executive is for them is for one to provide checks to the other. But now we've seen parliament the arguments for what fiscal policy should be. So like currently Kenya is in a debt is almost out of, we could say, debt crisis for the foreseeable future. Fiscal distress. Let me use the correct term. Fiscal distress for the foreseeable future. And that fiscal distress has actually elevated the need for more for the taxes to be for more revenue to be collected. And that more revenue to be collected is a result of the 10 years of what has been happening in Parliament, in the corridors of Parliament for the last 10 years. That fiscal expansion, for example, was largely advanced by the executive arm and here the National Treasury. But it reached a level that nobody could see that borrowing was future taxes, commitment of future taxes. And these future taxes were being committed at a rate that were required all to be collected within a certain period to be able to be able to be able to create. So this unsustainable public finances as is as a result of Parliament, we could say, slackening on their role. Then political processes, another part of why this is the mandatory first to explain further. The mandatory consideration of part of the finance bill is not only a parliamentary problem. It also the law, PFM law, requires the executive arm to prepare the finance bill in advance. And so that has to go to cabinet within a certain time period. And once the cabinet has passed it, it goes again to now to parliament. So that is a problem that needs to be cured. That only taxes should be dealt with in a certain way. And then another question that also needs to be dealt with is whether, in fact, the taxes should be amended through an omnibus legislation. Then the political processes. So the messaging by the main political parties, looking at the sentiment for the last 20 years, has always been around more development, and that more development actually is more taxes and also more government revenue being collected, and which means more taxes being levied. And then the convergence now of, because this is a system-wide problem, the interplay between how fiscal policy is administered and how taxation, and then now economic policy aggregates. So you let debt to get out of hand, it means you are going to end up with a capricious tax system. And then some of those things is the evidence that is required to review taxes, like consideration of what is buoyant, and some of the key issues like which that tax elasticity, the tax elasticity of those main of those taxes of those key taxes advanced is something that has not been dealt with. That evidence is always lacking in advancing policy. Now, as I wind up, uh, what are some of these key players in the tax information of tax code? Parliament, which has exclusive rights to determine what is tax policy, to determine, to even edit and even change uh, 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 what should form fiscal policy is they have that constitutional power, but the process and the mechanism. So they have an optimization problem. How they, for example, consider this the finance bill, and how they collect evidence on what each of those tax heads would yield, and what each of those tax proposals would do to the market is something that has not been completely spelled out. And that is one area that, as a primary player, they have. National Treasury, for National Treasury, we like to see more of evidence. That evidence uh, 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 of we are making a proposal of this specific tax proposal, and it's going to give this. It has this effect in the market. This is the level of distortion we expect, and this would yield that specific revenue, not a continuous variation like what has been happening on excise taxes. But you never see uh, uh, you never see those results. Then Kenya Revenue Authority, tax administration. Some parts of the Tax Procedures Act gives the Kenya Revenue, the KRA officers police powers. Some aspects gives Commissioner General powers to make to determine to seize documents which infringe property rights. Some of them, some legal notice, for example, gives powers to Kenya Revenue Authority to close plants. And some of those are constitutionally, that's a different constitutional threshold. What we are looking at is KRA should only be an administrator. And then for any infractions, all those should go to court. And there is a process on how you can get expedited deliberations in court, rather than now having bolstering this agency as a more powerful, as being it more powerful in a way that it harms constitutional protections. Political parties, it's always some of the things that we observed is political parties agree largely. So if you looked at the manifestos in 2022, all of them were making proposals on how they're going to provide this and that, and most of it was infrastructure led, which means if you looking at fiscal space, which meant more taxes, and people looking at this issue differently is something that, like commitment to reduce the size of the state, is not something that we've seen. And the office, the ODPP, in terms of prosecution, getting those officers to understand the economic analysis of taxes, to be able to make those better decisions. County assemblies, the issues of double taxation, uh, universities building evidence around uh, around major issues in the taxation system, uh, public policy think tanks, which is the same. So if you look at our power map analysis, we've put forward, so what is required is to optimize all these agencies to get to on the right hand side of having that more power and more interest, more power and also and also more interest, and that's still a big problem, especially to agencies like PBO and also universities, public policy think tanks, and CSOs. So we summarize some of the three main institutions that we'd like to see in the pathway for reform. So this is a peer political economy technique whereby we ask ourselves, what interest should an institution have? Looking at the constitution, looking at national legislation, and then what kind of reform focus it should it should get. So Parliament, so sustainable public finances. Sustainable public finances, meaning that recognizing that spending always the biggest issue in making public finances sustainable is to keep spending at a level that is that can be sustained. And there is a small theorem that proves that you cannot keep a primary fiscal deficit higher than economic growth. If you keep fiscal deficit higher than economic growth, it means that you'll be able to get you'll able to you cannot run deficits in perpetuity, meaning that you'll be able to get into problems in future. And that's Parliament's role. Keep those fiscal deficits lower than economic growth. If economic growth is 7%, fiscal deficit should be lower than that. And if economic growth is 3%, you keep those deficits in a place that allows you to maintain a fiscal space. And then the reform focus, low and moderate taxes, lower deficit. Now, another problem is emerging, that some of those taxes, the way they are levied, uh, 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 create an unintended consequences. So one time, so a tax, for example, on resin, the sticky glue, raised cost, for example, for things like diapers, or some of those a study on an excise tax on packaging material raises packaging material for some of these, and sometimes some of these, and where there are no explicit controls, for example, on food processing. Some people would opt out not to use those packaging material, and might create an unintended consequence. So some of those, and then require evidence in tax processes. One of the things that should be settled, that should be bipartisan in Kenya, is we need evidence. If you are making a tax proposal that it will yield more revenue, you'll need to demonstrate the distortionary effect and whether that the opportunity cost of not having that tax, and the opportunity cost of having that tax, which one creates more deadweight loss in the economy, and that whether those markets, and whether it will protect markets. National Treasury, macroeconomic stability, uh, higher fiscal deficit and higher aggressive tax revenue collections creates an unintended consequences to other macro indicators. And we need to have a buoyant tax system so that what only changes, you're only fighting to have more economic growth, and that creates that additional revenue. And that has not been the case. I should have put up a chart on uh, 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 tax as a share of GDP, tax as a share of GDP. You easily see, because that there's a problem, and that problem is not with more taxes. The problem is with the kind of taxes that are already in place and whether those taxes are already off limit. Yes, and then KRA. The main interest that KRA should have is a tax system dependent on voluntary compliance. For example, there are 21 million Kenyans with PINs, as confirmed by the PS National Treasury. There are 21 million Kenyans with PINs. You cannot chase 21 million Kenyans, and you cannot even imprison all of them. What the main goal should be, having those Kenyans having a tax rate that is easy to comply with, that relies on that voluntary compliance, so that it allows you to only enforce within a fewer part of the population. And then the reform focus confine its powers to only tax admin and a simple tax, and that is something that Parliament will enforce. So as I've spoken, I really want to, before I wind up, I only want to speak about three agencies here on this chart. The first one is judiciary. Largely, we really want the big understanding that we should see from the judiciary is that the understanding, first, judges who understand the economics of taxation. So that means more training, judiciary training institute and other places. But secondly, the interplay between protecting that constitutional protection, together with now fiscal policy and what fiscal policy should be. Reviewing that reviewing that area, because sometimes what is public interest, because anytime the whether a tax when a tax is discretionary and reduces both producer and consumer surplus, that is something that can be demonstrated. So that evidence, the ability to review that evidence, is something that we'd like to see. Second part is county assemblies. Uh, uh, then the realization that county assemblies, county governments receive equitable share, and therefore that aggressive tax drive should not play a bigger role. Should that you should not you only have one major tax aid, which is property, but do not replicate national government taxes, and also do not increase those levies to levels that are unsustainable. Use evidence to review that. And then the third agency that I want to speak about is the PBO. The PBO is Parliament's, the initial draft of the PBO that established the PBO was to have PBO as an agency within Parliament that can advise parliamentarians on that. And some of these technical matters are things that the PBO can help with because they represent that technical capability in Parliament. Conclusion. Uh, what are some of the areas of reform? Reviewing the length and complexity of the tax code, checks and balances with agencies tasked with the tax system from Parliament. That the realization that Parliament has to provide that oversight, that real oversight, to asking National Treasury and Kenya Revenue Authority on the questions of whether, for example, for the case of National Treasury, uh, on the case of efficiency, the efficiency of those taxes, and whether those taxes create more harm than good, and on the Kenya Revenue Administration on that administrative efficiency. Use of evidence in the introduction and variation, predictability. Only tax rates should be reviewed in the medium term. And for me, part of what our study is looking at is that an omnibus legislation should not be what Kenya uses as as part to review taxes. All taxes should be reviewed on a case-by-case basis to allow more ventilation of issues. And then in the medium term, National Treasury should ensure that Kenya's tax system is buoyant. The last one is fiscal incident analysis to determine whether tax system is equitable. Previous fiscal incident analysis. So if you look at the Public Expenditure Review report of 2017, you see that the National Treasury conducted a fiscal incident analysis and showed, for example, the effect of both direct and indirect taxes on poverty, and actually showed that there's evidence that shows indirect taxes like VAT and also excise taxes creating more, being responsible for creating poverty. Thank you.
I see we have a number of lengthy comments on the chat box. So before I read any comments, does anyone have a question that you'd like to raise your hand? Okay, so because I don't see any hands, I see the first one is, do we know how much of income tax is personal income tax and how much is corporate income tax? And then I think Leo, you can respond to that. Duncan says, thanks Leo and Jackie for the good presentation. A quick one. So the person he refers to there is me. A quick one for Leo in the slide on players' information and formulation of the tax code. I did not see the citizen or the public. Or does it mean they have limited or no role at all? Or does it mean that they are secondary or tertiary players? So that's also obviously to Leo. Then how practical is voluntary compliance to the hard tax being the largest segment? That's by Judith. Then Alai asks, given that Kenyan political tax systems is more of interest-based, can there be an infrastructural approach, especially from IEA and other actors, in coming with more friendly approach in collecting taxes? May it be ideational or institutional accounts, hence the Mwananchi doesn't feel overburdened. Then team, thanks Leo, this is insightful. However, even with evidence, Parliament and KRA continually ignore evidence. An example is the annual inflation adjustment for excess duty. Many organizations presented evidence on the harm. However, they went ahead even when the evidence showed that they collected less due to slowdown of economic activity and avoidance. Okay, so I think that's a question, comments. So Leo, you can comment on that. Then Colin, solid presentation. Thank you. What have been the economic implications of the judiciary halting the continuation of certain tax policies midway into their implementation? So team continues. If we cite the statements by the PS Treasury, where he's saying that Kenyans are not overburdened, then it's clear that policymakers do not understand the tax burden. Can you extend this to county governments? The challenge county taxes pose on SMEs and create instances of double taxation. Thanks, Judy, for the compliment. Then Esther, thanks, Leo. At the county level finance bill, at the county level finance bill exists as the only legal framework for tax management and collection. County assemblies should formulate revenue laws that provide basis for annual tax adjustments. Example there lacks valuation rules, property, and so on. So also just some comments. So I think, Leo, if you can give some very summarized responses, yeah, just come in and respond in a very highly summarized way, so that you can give one final chance for any other questions.
Yeah. So I can start with the comments from Collins and Tim. Collins, the question for us, the biggest issue as the law and economy program at the IEA is the focus on protecting constitutional protecting Kenyan citizens from constitutional from that constitutional arms, like protecting giving them those constitutional protections to arms that come midway. So the big issue is that even if a tax even if the tax is altered, it means certain Parliament has to take a decision and reconfigure public finances in a way that allows for that adjustment. We don't see it as the other way, so that because fiscal policy, largely direct spending, might be responsible for in certain markets, but private sector led growth is still the biggest driver of economic growth in Kenya. While it grew in the last 10 years, but it's still private sector is still and especially that you can see from personal consumption and the rest. Tim Jagi, so I think this kind of studies form basis whether national when the PS National Treasury says Kenyans are not overburdened. I think such kind of statement should form the basis of calling for renewed whether for example like statutory instruments act, whether we can have, so for example the statutory instruments act requires some legislations that have economic that create economic burden as legislation stroke regulations to be to go through the regulatory impact assessment. And I think we should go back again to requiring, for example, when the PS National Treasury says something like that they provide evidence. They have to provide that. They have to provide that evidence, and then we can all parliamentarians that we require them to have that evidence when they make certain decisions. So, for example, when they endorse then they endorse that inflation adjustment. If we had a provision that requires them expressly in the statutory instruments not to accept something contrary to the evidence, that can be reviewed by the High Court because they'll be now reviewing a decision of Parliament on the basis of that certain evidence existed. But we need to go. We don't need to tire. And I know we've spoken together about this. That we don't need to tire. To get tired about those decisions. The the question from Orimba that the infrastructure approach, especially from the IEA, or that whether how should Mwananchi should not feel overburdened, is that there are ways on how to see that whether that burden is extensive or not. And you can see it through the buoyancy, you can see it through the elasticity, you can see it through several other ways. So, for example, if the economy, like on excise taxes on beer, the economy has expanded in the last 5 years, but the revenue collections by government on excise keep lagging behind. It shows that there is a market problem, and that market problem needs to be addressed. The question from Judith on how practical is voluntary compliance to the ad tax. So for us, so one of the things that we don't think a National Treasury has advanced ideas, especially on this further, one of the best ways on demonstrating voluntary compliance is employment, how KRA collects employment income. They know you won't move away. They know you are there. As an employer, you are in that address. You are not moving anywhere. You collecting them. You're collecting that income from them. You once you on the 9th, once you send that those checks to KRA, you don't hear from them. But if you fail to send, that is when you hear from them. And mostly collection from on the pay side is always voluntary and actually has netted continues to net more income from that. So I think that is one example. The other example that we think some of those rates, if National Treasury advanced flat tax rates for some of these taxes, uh, that is not progressive, that does not have these other administrative inefficiencies, we think that voluntary compliance can become a bigger issue. From the question from Duncan, uh, 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 so in the PEA, we made that that the power belongs to that sovereign power belongs to the people, but that most of these agencies exercise the power that is donated to them. And we emphasize, perhaps maybe in the graph, that is something that we need to we need to rectify, because we had a place where the citizen is at the middle most of the time. It's what we want in the PEA. We expressly identified organized groups because citizens do not tend to be to be organized groups. And then another question from Tim and on the question of county government. It's true that in counties there is a problem. So we are working with uh, uh, some partners in 3 counties to develop a similar analysis. But we had already, based on our interactions with some other institutions like the Kenya Association of Manufacturers, we had already seen, we had participated in some analysis that shows actually counties are not considering, are actually collecting rates outside. Some of those rates are in an aggressive manner, the enforcement style. Also, they are collecting some of those rates without actually having even a policy in place. The use of evidence is very limited, actually, if not at all. So we had seen that. So it's still that analysis, that kind of analysis at the county level is something that we'd consider. Maybe we can consider some specific counties and look at what explains that. Uh, uh, yes, Esther, that is true. County governments, whether that county assemblies should formulate revenue laws that provide basis for annual tax adjustments. So in some counties, like for example, we're looking at Nakuru, some of those, so that is true. So we're looking at some of those, for example, what legislation allows, what was the legal reasoning behind this? And so we find that some document that was passed by the county council, the municipal council of Nakuru in a very long time is now what forms that basis. So looking at the modern economy now, given that data is available, GCP data is available, we can even quantify some sectors to some level of accuracy. That now should form a basis. So I agree with that recommendation. Uh, Question from Oliro on social contract and how this can be made to galvanize public and participation in determining the broad contours of tax policy as opposed to the current apathy and resignation. Yeah, so that is a broad issue that we've taken. But we've not, although we in our analysis we've not characterized it as that. We've characterized it as a social contract that Kenyans gave unto themselves, the Constitution of Kenya 2010, and that Constitution of Kenya 2010 made some specific requirements, including Parliament being the Parliament having a central position in determining what should be fiscal policy should be and what. So I understand and I agree completely. I agree with that. Mushai, question from. So perhaps Jackie, I can enter that, catch a breath, and then as you go through the other questions.
Okay. Yes. Thanks for the responses and for all the questions so far. So because we are completely out of time, I only see one more from Mushai. First of all, thanks Mushai for being here. So he says that another key issue is that government starts with expenditure plans, then tries to raise money to meet those plans rather than starting with how much revenue there is to determine expenditure. In other words, it is the government's insatiable appetite that is the real driver of taxation. Absolutely. I mean, I agree fully with that. It's definitely from our analysis, what the main emerging issue, actually, we've said this before as IEA, that the key problem that we see is that Kenya's key problem is living, put in the simplest way, living the government living beyond its means. That's why we have that big deficit, and of course, to fill that up, then the government has to figure out or conjure up whichever way, and that shows up as irrational taxation proposals, revenue generation proposals. So I agree with you, Mushai, fully. I think Leo would also agree. I see Alai's hand is up. So because he's the only one that, yeah, will give you an opportunity to ask your question. And then we, Leo, as you respond to that comment and the question that will come. That you'll also give your closing remarks so that we try and wrap this up. So Alai, we'll give you 2 minutes to ask your questions. You can unmute yourself and ask the question. So Leo, please respond as you make your closing remarks.
So from the comment stroke question from Shai, I have a very interesting perspective around that, and it's one of the things that we should. So the Constitution has set out the functions of Parliament related to fiscal policy. What we need to be very careful and really try and get Parliament to consider is how they conduct themselves with relation to fiscal policy. Because it's true, what you've illustrated is true, that revenue that realistic revenue collections from prior years should be able, and which should be an average of last year plus or minus 3, what we have agreed in the PFM. Then that that allows now Parliament to set spending targets. So we need to think how Parliament, because there is a big issue, because Parliament is expected to pass laws, but we need specific requirements in the legislations on how Parliament can conduct itself. Because Parliament, one of them is that they cannot go beyond what they have agreed in the PFM Act. When you agreed to the PFM together with EAC countries that we have a fiscal deficit of not more than 3%, then that should be the case. Because once we go outside that 3% range, then we get lost, because we need legislations on how the limitations of Parliament's conduct. So, like Article 201 requires public finance, public participation on all. The key word there is all financial issues, meaning that we need Parliament to how they consider the finance bill, how they consider legislations on revenue raising measures to come in a certain manner that in itself as a body they become more transparent and more realistic, and drive this economy in a way and pass legislations that drive this economy in a way that would be sustainable in the long term. We need, because that is the problem. If you look at other economies, for example, like Australia, which has had before COVID almost 30 years of economic growth without a recession. Parliament moved. Parliament, it's actually Parliament that changed largely compared. Looking at also other countries, Poland, inviting some level of scrutiny, and that's why in the post-2010 constitutional dispensation, when the Statutory Instruments Act was passed in 2013, and Parliament committed to using regulatory impact assessment to determine some of those decisions that have significant burden to the Kenyan, not to the economy, but also to citizens. We need to go back to getting Parliament again to that level, so that they are able to invite some level of scrutiny. However, as it is today, that's a big challenge. That's a big challenge, because they pass laws in certain ways that our constitution will not, that if tested against constitutional principles, they don't survive. No wonder the judiciary keeps flagging those unconstitutional questions. Thank you.